My name is Terry Horner, and I work with Methodist Sports Medicine, the orthopedic specialist, and I'm co-director of the Indiana Sports Concussion Network. I'm a neurosurgeon, and I've limited my practice in the most recent years to the evaluation, treatment, and prevention of concussion injury to the brain, particularly related to sports activity. Concussions have become a hot topic in sports mainly because of the great interest in trying to protect players, especially in the NFL. The awareness of concussions, as we see on many television programs, in the newspaper, and other sources, have taken top priority in the news. It is a serious injury, and one of the reasons we have developed this video for parents, athletes, coaches, and anyone else participating or instructing sports programs. What are we going to learn today? We're going to learn the definition of a concussion, the rules, regulations, and laws, how to diagnose a concussion, neurocognitive testing, sideline assessment, treatment of a concussion, when the athlete can return to play, and a team plan. First of all, let's look at some of the statistics. Approximately 1.6 to 3.8 million sports and recreational related traumatic brain injuries, or what we call concussions, occur in the United States each year. The most common causes are falls, recreational trauma, unintentionally struck by or against events, assaults, and sports. Each year in the United States, there are approximately 400,000 sports-related concussions. Football is the most common sport in males. Soccer is the most common sport in females for concussions to occur. However, it's seen in all sports, particularly contact sports like football, soccer, hockey, lacrosse, rugby, basketball, baseball, volleyball. But it's not limited to just those. We see it in wrestling, in cheerleading, and even in swimming. In order to understand concussions, we first need to know about the rules or the law pertaining to concussions. Indiana proposed a concussion law July 1st, 2011, and it became effective July 1st, 2012. Indiana is one of over 35 states that now have laws pertaining to concussions. The Indiana State Concussion Law says in effect that on July 1st, 2011, Indiana Senate Bill 93 will require the Department of Education to distribute guidelines, information sheets, and forms to inform and educate coaches, student athletes, and their parents of the nature and risk of concussions and head injuries. Each year a student athlete participates, the information must be given to them and to their parents. The parents will be required to return a form acknowledging that they received the information to the student's coach before beginning practice for a sport. If a student athlete is suspected of sustaining a head injury or concussion, they must be removed from play at the time of the injury. The student athlete may not return to play until they have received written clearance from a licensed healthcare provider trained in evaluating head injuries. Well, now we know the law. Other things that we need to know is the definition of a concussion. We can't recognize a concussion unless we know the definition. The definition of concussion is still evolving because we're learning new things about concussions every few years. If we break it down into the most elementary form, we would say that it is a head injury, usually associated with an acceleration or a deceleration or a rotational injury to the head. And this must be associated with one or more of 22 symptoms that are commonly seen with concussions. So, to diagnose a concussion, we have to have a head injury and we have to have at least one of the 22 symptoms. Now, what does a concussion do to the brain? Well, we call it a functional injury as opposed to a structural injury. A structural injury would be bleeding, swelling, or bruising of the brain. A functional injury means that the cell membrane that surrounds the cell and keeps certain things inside the cell and keeps other things that are outside the cell from getting in is disrupted, so that we have potassium leaking out and calcium leaking in, and that disrupts the ability of the brain to function normally. It also causes a decrease in the blood flow to the brain, and this causes a decrease in the ability to get sugar and oxygen to the brain, so it continues to not be able to function well. This creates what we call an energy crisis, and therefore the brain cannot respond to a second injury that might occur on top of the first injury. That is a very important part of a functional injury, is trying to prevent a second injury occurring before the first injury is completely healed. CT and MRI scans are normal in a concussion or in a functional injury. Why are we concerned about concussions? Well, the brain is a more complicated organ. It's more prone to injury, possibly permanent. It's more prone to repeat injuries. It takes longer to recover. And young people are more vulnerable to injury because their brain is immature. Other dangers of a concussion, most importantly, is that the athlete doesn't often understand the consequences of the concussion. And they may not admit to the fact that they've got symptoms or that they had a concussion. Such underreporting of symptoms is common in all sports, but it's very important that we educate the athlete to be honest with us so that we can get them out of harm's way. What are the goals of treating concussions? Well, first we need to recognize that the concussion has occurred, and then we need to remove the player from the game or practice. We then need to treat the player, and then determine when it is safe to return to play. Well, how do we diagnose a concussion? Well, typically, particularly when we're on the sidelines or on the court, we're going to look for what we call symptoms and signs. Now, symptoms are not something that, as a bystander, we can look at the athlete and tell that he's having symptoms. Only the athlete can tell us that he's having symptoms. We break the symptoms down into several categories: physical symptoms, thinking or cognitive symptoms, emotional symptoms, and sleep symptoms. Let's take a look at what these are. Physical symptoms include headaches, nausea, fatigue, visual problems, balance problems, sensitivity to light and sensitivity to noise, numbness and tingling, vomiting, and dizziness. Thinking or cognitive symptoms include feeling mentally foggy, and many athletes will tell you this. They just can't wrap their mind around what they're trying to do. They may have problems concentrating. They may have problems remembering. For example, a paragraph that they could usually read and retain what was in it, they may have to read 2 or 3 times before they can concentrate on what it is and remember what was in the paragraph. Or they'll commonly complain of feeling more slowed down mentally. Emotional symptoms include irritability. You may have an athlete that is the calmest person in the world, but after a concussion, for apparently no reason at all. They may fly off the handle when you're talking to them about something. They may exhibit sadness, or they may complain of sadness. They may feel more emotional. For example, even a male may just sit down and start crying. Or they may feel that everything's all right, everything seems rosy, even though they're having symptoms, and just not take things seriously. Or they may exhibit nervousness. How about sleep symptoms? Well, a lot of times they feel drowsy all the time. They may be sleeping more than usual. They may come home from school, instead of taking a nap, they may go to bed and not wake up until the next morning. Or they may be sleeping less than usual. For example, they just can't get to sleep, either because they have headache or they feel like their mind is racing. So they may be sleeping less than usual. Or they may have trouble falling asleep. So obviously, if they're sleeping less than usual and having trouble falling asleep, they're going to be drowsy the next day because they do not get restful sleep. Now, symptoms are an extremely important part of diagnosing a concussion. Athletes now know that if they're diagnosed with a concussion, they're going to be taken out of practice or taken out of the game. They may not be able to return for a period of time. So a lot of times they're not going to be honest with us. So we have to ask them about their symptoms in a little bit of a different way. For example, if we say, "How are you feeling?" or "Do you have a headache?" there's two simple answers to that on the athlete's part. One is, "I'm feeling fine," and two, "No, I don't have a headache." So we kind of assume that they are having all of the symptoms that we just got through discussing. So we assume that they have them. So when I would ask them about their headache, I wouldn't say, "Are you having a headache?" I would say, "Is your headache worse in the morning or worse in the afternoon?" Or if I'm asking them about dizziness, I wouldn't say, "Are you dizzy?" I would say, "Is your dizziness worse when you turn too quickly or when you get up and down?" So you see, they get caught up in that and they start telling you about their symptoms before they realize they're not supposed to. So you have to be a little bit smart about how you evaluate them. Asymptomatic, or being without symptoms, is not an easily defined term, but it is absolutely at the core of proper concussion management, because we want them to have no symptoms before we let them get back.